Hold on a second. Yeah, you with the mower, don't let a single blade of grass land on my side of the fence. That was the first thing she said. Not hello, not good morning, just that. And I remember thinking, this is about to go sideways in a way she does not understand. Because 3 minutes later, she picked up her phone, called the sheriff on a kid trying to help my grandfather, and without realizing it, she set off a chain reaction that cost her entire neighborhood something they'd depended on for years. I'm talking about access, utilities, a shortcut that saved them miles. And yeah, it was worth a lot more than pride. Before I get into all that, go ahead and drop where you're watching from. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. Alright, so here's how it all unfolded. My family's land sits just outside a mid-sized town you probably wouldn't recognize unless you grew up there. About 20 acres give or take, mostly open grass. A few stubborn oak trees that have outlived every argument ever had on that property, and a red barn that leans just enough to make you nervous, but not enough to fall. It's been in our family for 3 generations, passed down quietly, no big ceremony, just the understanding that you take care of it because it took care of you. My grandfather, Walter, he's 78 now, and for as long as I can remember, he treated that land like it was alive. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, he'd fire up this old riding mower that sounded like it was coughing up its last breath, and he'd go row by row, slow, steady, making these clean lines across the grass like he was painting something only he could see. I used to sit on the porch steps as a kid and watch him do it, never rushing, never cutting corners, literally or figuratively. And if you asked him why he cared so much, he'd just shrug and say, because it matters. That was his whole philosophy, simple, stubborn, and somehow right. But this past year, things changed. It didn't happen all at once, more like little cracks forming where you don't notice until they spread. His knees started giving out first, then his hands, just a slight shake at first, then enough that he had to grip the railing a little tighter every time he stepped down from the porch. Walking across the yard became an effort, not a habit. And the grass, well, the grass doesn't wait for anyone. It grew faster than he could keep up, creeping higher, uneven, wild in spots where it used to be precise. I'd catch him sitting out there in the afternoons, just staring at it, not angry exactly, but bothered, like something inside him didn't sit right with letting it go. He never complained, never asked for help. That wasn't his way, but you could feel it. Then one morning, out of nowhere, this kid shows up. Couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17 if he was pushing it, skinny, sunburned in that way you only get from being outside more than you should be. And he pulls up on this beat-up push mower that looked like it had seen better decades, not just days. I was inside grabbing coffee when I saw him through the window, walking right up to my grandfather like he belonged there. And I remember stepping out onto the porch thinking I was about to have to tell him to leave. But before I could say anything, I hear the kid go, "Sir, I got you." Just like that. No pitch, no explanation. My grandfather looks at him, squints a little like he's trying to figure out if this is real, and goes, "You sure about that?" And the kid just nods, already pulling the starter cord. That mower coughs, sputters, then finally catches, and off he goes. No discussion about money, no agreement signed, nothing formal, just action. And here's the thing, he came back the next week. And the week after that. Same time, same quiet energy, just showing up and doing the work like it mattered. He didn't rush it either, didn't cut corners, he'd slow down around the edges, make sure the lines were clean, almost like he understood what that meant to my grandfather without anyone having to explain it. We asked him once what he wanted for it, and he just shrugged and said, "I've got time." That was it. Didn't want cash, didn't want recognition. Just showed up. And for the first time in months, I saw my grandfather sit on that porch and not look defeated, just quiet, watching, like something heavy had been lifted off him without him having to admit it. Now, if that were the whole story, it'd be a nice one, right? Kid helps old man. Everyone feels good. Fade to black. But right behind our property line, like literally, you could throw a rock and hit their fence. There's this upscale neighborhood, the kind with matching mailboxes, identical lawns, and a homeowners association that takes itself very seriously. And at the center of that whole operation was a woman named Denise Holbrook. Denise didn't just live there. She ran that place, or at least acted like she did. Her husband sat on the HOA board, but Denise was the one you dealt with if anything didn't meet their standards. And for years, she'd had this quiet, simmering issue with our land. Not because we did anything wrong, but because we didn't fit into her idea of how things should look. Too wild, too unstructured, too not hers. She'd made comments before, little passive-aggressive remarks about property values, appearances, how things reflect on the community, even though we weren't part of her community at all. My grandfather would just smile politely and ignore her, which I think bothered her more than anything. Because people like Denise, they don't like being ignored. And that's where things started to shift. Because the morning she saw that kid mowing near the fence, she didn't just see someone helping. She saw something she thought she could control. And that's exactly where she made her biggest mistake. So that morning felt normal at first. Almost too normal, like the kind of quiet you only notice in hindsight. The sun was already up but still soft, not that harsh midday glare. And there was this light breeze pushing through the grass that made everything look like it was moving in slow waves, almost calming if you didn't know what was about to hit. I was leaning against the porch railing with a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, just watching the kid. His name was Eli, by the way. I should have said that earlier. Guiding that mower along the fence line with this careful, deliberate pace, like he didn't want to miss a single inch. My grandfather was sitting a few feet behind him in that old metal chair we've had forever, the one that creaks every time you shift your weight, just watching, not saying much, just taking it in. And I remember thinking how strange it was that someone so young could understand something so simple, that helping didn't need permission, it just needed effort. Then I saw her. Denise didn't walk down that hill behind her neighborhood, she charged down it. Phone in one hand, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was about to conduct an inspection, and even from a distance you could tell she was already upset about something, like she'd been waiting for a reason to be mad and finally found one. She didn't stop at the fence, didn't call out from a distance. No, she walked straight around the side where the gate was, unlatched it like she had every right to be there, and headed directly toward Eli. He noticed her about 2 seconds before she reached him, pulled the mower handle back, and the engine sputtered down into silence. You need to shut that down. Right now. No introduction, no explanation, just an order. Eli blinked, still holding onto the handle, clearly trying to process what was happening. Ma'am, I'm just helping him out, he said, nodding back toward my grandfather. And that should have been the end of it, right? A normal person hears that, maybe asks a question, maybe even backs off. But Denise didn't come for a conversation. She came for control. You are not authorized to operate equipment on HOA-managed property, she snapped, already pulling her phone up like she was reading from some invisible script. And I remember this exact moment because it was the first time my grandfather tried to stand up for himself that morning. He leaned forward in his chair, hands gripping the armrests, voice a little shaky but still clear enough to carry. This is my land. For simple words. And she didn't even let him finish the thought behind them. She turned slightly, like she'd heard something irrelevant, and started dialing. That's when I set my coffee down. Because there's a difference between someone being annoying and someone crossing a line, and she had just stepped clean over it without even noticing. I started walking down from the porch, not rushing yet, just trying to see if maybe, just maybe, this could still de-escalate. But by the time I got halfway across the yard, she was already speaking into her phone. Yes, I need a unit out here, she said, voice sharp, controlled, rehearsed. There's an unauthorized individual operating machinery on HOA-controlled land. Potential liability issue. I actually stopped walking for a second when I heard that, because it was so confidently wrong it almost didn't make sense. HOA-controlled land. She said it like it was fact, like saying it out loud would somehow make it true. Eli looked over at me then, not scared exactly, but uncertain, like he was wondering if he'd done something he wasn't supposed to. And that hit me harder than anything she'd said. Because here's this kid, showing up week after week, asking for nothing, doing something most people wouldn't even think to do, and now he's being treated like a problem. My grandfather tried again, quieter this time. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But Denise was already a few steps ahead in her own mind. She ended the call, crossed her arms, and looked around like she was waiting for backup to arrive and confirm everything she believed. You people really need to understand, she said, almost calmly now, which somehow made it worse, that standards exist for a reason. And I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loud, not mocking, just a short, disbelieving breath of a laugh. Standards, I said, finally stepping into the space between her and Eli. You're standing on land that doesn't belong to you, telling someone else what they're allowed to do on it. She didn't like that. You could see it immediately, the way her posture stiffened, the way her eyes narrowed just enough to signal that this wasn't going the way she expected. This property directly affects our community, she shot back. We have easement rights. And there it was. That word, easement. She said it like it was a shield, like it gave her authority over everything she could see. And technically, she wasn't entirely wrong, but she also didn't understand the full weight of what she was invoking. Because easement doesn't mean ownership. It doesn't mean control. It means access, under very specific conditions. Conditions that, if broken, come with consequences most people never bother reading about. I took a step closer, not aggressive, just enough to make sure she heard me clearly. You have access, I said. That's it. You don't get to decide what happens on this side of the fence. For a split second, I thought that might land. That maybe she'd pause, reconsider, realize she was pushing into territory she didn't fully understand. But instead, she smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a confident one, just that tight, dismissive kind that says, I'm about to prove you wrong. We'll see about that, she said. And right on cue, we heard it. The low hum of a patrol vehicle pulling up along the gravel road. Timing couldn't have been more perfect if she'd planned it herself. Eli stepped back a little, instinctively putting space between himself and the situation, and my grandfather just leaned back in his chair again, like he'd already decided how this was going to end. I turned toward the road as the sheriff's vehicle came into view, dust kicking up behind it, and I remember thinking, this is either going to be very simple or very expensive. The truck rolled to a stop, engine idling, and out stepped Deputy Marcus Reed. Now, Reed's been around this area a long time. He's the kind of guy who doesn't rush, doesn't assume, just takes in a situation piece by piece before saying anything. He adjusted his hat, looked at the fence line, then at Eli, then at my grandfather, and finally at Denise, who was already stepping forward to meet him like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. Officer, thank you for coming, she said quickly. As I explained, there's an unauthorized worker. Reed held up a hand, not rude, just firm enough to pause her. Let me take a look first, ma'am. And that's when everything shifted, because you could see it in his face almost immediately. That subtle change when someone realizes the story they were told doesn't match what they're looking at. He walked a few steps forward, boots crunching lightly against the gravel, then stopped right at the edge of where our property line begins. He didn't cross it, just stood there, taking it in. Sir, he said, nodding toward my grandfather, this your land? My grandfather gave a small nod. Always has been. Reed glanced at Eli. You got permission to be here? Eli nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Reed exhaled, slow, almost like he was confirming something he already suspected. Then he turned back to Denise. And when he spoke this time, his tone was still calm, but there was a clarity to it that cut straight through everything she'd been building. Ma'am, he said, this is private property. That young man has every right to be here. He paused just long enough for it to sink in. And you're the one who crossed the line. You could have heard a pin drop in that moment. Denise just stood there, completely still, like her brain was trying to catch up to what she'd just heard. Because in her version of events, she was the one enforcing rules, not breaking them. And for the first time since she walked down that hill, she didn't have anything to say. But the thing is, that should have been the end of it. A misunderstanding, maybe a little embarrassment, everyone goes their separate ways. That's how these situations usually play out. Except this one didn't. Because standing there, watching all of this unfold, I realized something. She hadn't just made a mistake. She'd made it official. And that changed everything. And that's the part people don't always think about. It's one thing to be wrong in the moment. To say something you can walk back later, maybe laugh it off, maybe pretend it didn't happen. But once you bring law enforcement into it, once there's a report, a record, something written down with names and claims attached to it, it stops being just a bad interaction. It becomes evidence. And standing there, watching Denise try to piece together what just happened, I realized she hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had just handed us something she couldn't take back. Deputy Reed wasn't aggressive about it, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He just asked a few more questions, simple ones, clarifying what had already become obvious. Did you state to dispatch that this was HOA-controlled land? He asked. Denise hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. I was under the impression, ma'am, he cut in gently. That's not what I asked. And there it was again, that quiet pressure, the kind that doesn't shout but still forces the truth out into the open. Yes, she said finally, her voice tighter now. Reed nodded once, like he expected that answer, then glanced over at me. You got documentation on the property lines? I didn't say anything right away. I just turned and started walking back toward the barn. Because this was the moment I'd almost forgotten about. Years ago, honestly, I was a kid when it happened. My grandfather had some kind of legal back and forth with the original developers of that neighborhood. Nothing dramatic, just one of those quiet disputes over access roads and utility lines that gets settled with paperwork nobody reads twice. Except my grandfather did read it. Every line. And he never forgot it. I pushed open the barn door, that familiar creak echoing a little louder than usual, and headed straight to the old metal filing cabinet tucked against the wall. It took me maybe 10 seconds to find it. The deed, folded neatly inside a worn envelope, edges softened from age, but still perfectly intact. And I remember holding it for a second before heading back out, thinking she really should have just minded her business. When I walked back up, everyone was still in place, like the scene had been paused waiting for this exact moment to continue. I handed the document to Reed, and he took his time with it, flipped through a few pages, scanned the text, then stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but recognition. Well, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. Then he looked up. You might want to read this part, he said, turning the document slightly toward Denise. She didn't move at first. Pride, maybe, or denial. But eventually, curiosity, or concern, got the better of her, and she stepped closer. Reed tapped a specific section with his finger. Right there. She leaned in, eyes scanning the paragraph, and I watched it happen in real time. That shift. That moment when someone realizes they've stepped into something way bigger than they thought. The clause wasn't complicated, just specific. It stated that any false claim, legal complaint, or misrepresentation initiated by the HOA or its representatives against our property would result in the immediate termination of their easement rights across our land. No warning, no appeal, automatic. And that easement? That wasn't just some casual privilege. It was their shortcut road into town, their maintenance access for utility lines. Even part of their drainage system ran through a corner of our property. Lose that, and suddenly their perfect neighborhood becomes a logistical nightmare. Denise read it once, then again, slower the second time, like maybe the words would change if she gave them enough attention. That can't be enforceable, she said finally, but there wasn't much conviction behind it anymore. Reed shrugged slightly. Looks pretty clear to me. I crossed my arms, not smug, not gloating, just steady. You filed a false claim, I said. It's on record now. She shook her head quickly, like she could physically reject the reality of it. I didn't file anything. I made a call. That's all it takes, Reed replied. Dispatch logs it. That's documentation. And just like that, it was done. You could almost feel it, like something invisible snapping into place. No dramatic sound, no flashing lights, just a quiet, irreversible shift. Denise stepped back, her whole posture different now, less rigid, less certain. For the first time since she walked onto our land, she looked unsure. This is ridiculous, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. We'll have our attorneys look at this. And they did. Over the next few weeks, things got interesting. Letters were sent, calls were made, meetings were held behind closed doors in that neighborhood that used to operate like everything was always under control. But here's the thing about airtight clauses, they don't care how many lawyers you hire. They don't bend because someone's uncomfortable with the outcome. Every attempt to challenge it ran into the same wall. The wording was clear, the condition had been met, and the consequence was automatic. Eventually, the HOA had to accept it. They lost the easement. Just like that. The shortcut road? Closed. The maintenance crews? Had to reroute. Utility access? Suddenly a much bigger problem than anyone had planned for. I heard from someone who lived over there that property values dipped almost immediately once the reality set in. Turns out, convenience matters more than curated lawns and matching mailboxes. And Denise, she didn't last long after that. Within a month, she was voted out of whatever position she held, quietly removed by the same people who used to back her up. Funny how fast support disappears when decisions start costing money. But honestly, none of that was the part that stuck with me. Not the legal win, not the fallout, not even the irony of how it all played out. It was that afternoon, after everything had settled down, when the sun started dipping just enough to cast those long shadows across the yard again. Eli had finished mowing, same as always, clean lines stretching across the grass like nothing had ever interrupted them. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, gave a small nod like he was done, and started packing up his mower without saying much. I walked over, handed him a bottle of water, and said, "You know you didn't have to come back today, right?" He shrugged, took a sip, and said, "I said I would." That was it. No speech, no need for recognition. Just consistency. I watched him leave the same way he always did, quiet, unbothered, like he hadn't just been in the middle of something most adults would have turned into a full-blown argument. Then I turned back toward the porch. My grandfather was still sitting there, same chair, same spot, but something about him felt different. Lighter, maybe, or just at peace. He didn't say anything when I walked up beside him, just kept looking out over the yard. And after a while, he smiled. Not big, not exaggerated, just a small, genuine smile that told me everything I needed to know. "Looks good," he said softly. And I realized he wasn't just talking about the grass. So yeah, that's what happened. One person trying to control something that wasn't theirs, another just trying to help without asking for anything in return, and somewhere in the middle, a decision that changed more than anyone expected. Now I'm curious what you think. Was it justified? Did she deserve what happened? Or did things go too far over what could have just been a simple misunderstanding? Because depending on how you look at it, this is either a story about consequences or a story about how quickly things can spiral when pride gets involved. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sit with you a little longer after they're over, go ahead and follow along.